Good afternoon, everyone. So this morning, Sasha was keeping everyone from coffee. I think I'm keeping everyone from beer. So we both got the bad end of the stick here. But I get everyone after coffee. So there's that. I get that advantage. So my name's Dave Malouf. I'm letting Milan off the hook because he's just exhausted to do the introduction, so I'll just introduce myself. I work for a company called DigitalOcean. I'm the director of product design there. I'm also known as one of the chief founders of the Interaction Design Association. I also run a couple of conferences outside of that. One's called Enterprise User Experience, or Enterprise UX, and the other one is called the Design Ops Summit, which is going to be more related to my talk this afternoon. Anything else you want to know about me, feel free to ask on Twitters or anywhere else. I'm pretty much an open book. I have a lifelong AMA, I would say. So feel free to ask anything at any time. So we're going to talk about design operations. And before we do that, I want to go a little bit deeper into not an introduction as so much as like a lens to describe myself. So for almost 20 years now, I have been an internal designer. I have been inside the corporate monster in one way, shape, or form. I'm now working for the smallest company I've worked for since the millennium. It's 300 people. So I have worked for organizations of several thousand, and I have worked for organizations of several hundred thousand. Now I'm working for 300. So it's a little bit different, but my enterprise experience is from those other organizations. And currently, I'm designing technology, which is for enterprises. So constantly thinking about how to do technology for tech monsters, basically. That's one part of the lens. The other part of the lens is I'm an interaction designer. So I've come up from the view of the particulate to the system, as opposed to from the system down. So some of that lens is going to come out. And the other lens I already mentioned is I direct the team. I direct a team of 10 people, and so I'm constantly thinking about them and about that organization and about the organizations of the communities that I deal with. So those are some of the lenses for me to think about. And in this process of engaging my communities, I've come up with a question, and that question is battery? No, not battery. There we go. Is how do we amplify the value of design investment? Right? Yes, we want to get more investment. And part of this is I have never worked in an organization where design is well-funded. Have you? Anyone? Right. So why is that? Why is design not well-funded? Now, you can argue no part of the organization is well-funded. I don't think that's actually true. If it is true, then there's better funded and not so better funded. And I find that design, call me a little victimizing here, but like design is probably the low end of the totem pole of the total product organizations that I've worked for. And I've been wondering, why is that? And so what I've discovered through my observations, and it's just a hypothesis, is that the largest obstacle to design is that no one actually understands the value of design. We talk about what design can do, but we don't talk about really where the value of design is. And this is a really important question because it impacts how we operationalize design, which is the point of the talk that I'm going to give. And the thing that I would put out there, just as a growing part of my hypothesis, is that design has been valued incorrectly for the what it delivers, not for the how it delivers. And because it's been valued for the what, people are like, well, I can do that what. I can push pixels around the screen. I can create wireframes. I can create a journey map. I can create personas, as opposed to, are you doing it the way that a designer would do it? Are you doing it how design goes about doing it? And there are ways that we can teach everyone to be a designer, and that's awesome, and it's not about owning the system in any way, but you need to value that system of verbs in order to even try to train yourself to do it. And that's where my premise comes in. But when we talk about value, it needs to answer some questions, which is, really, why should I care? Why should I care about you? Why should I care about what you deliver? And the value is also justifying investment. If you value something, you buy it, right? There's currency exchange for this. And it suggests, what should you be measuring in order to know that you're getting return on that investment? And that one is a really challenging statement, and I'd love to have conversations with people about how do you really measure the success of the design if if what we're trying to measure isn't the what, but the how? And that I don't have answers for yet, and I'd love maybe to spark some conversation around that. What I do have some ideas for is what is the proposed value of design in that how. And these are 4 areas. It's not meant to be complete, but it's the things that I feel I value most about design and that I've heard from others that really differentiate how design does its how. And the first thing is driving and understanding and empathy. And I separate those two on purpose. One is about trying to not be emotional, but trying to be cognitive. So Indy Young talks about 2 kinds of empathy, cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, and there's a few others out there as well. And understanding is that cognitive empathy, where it's I just need to understand what you're thinking, what you value, and what you find meaning out of, right? And I think that's actually the most important kind of empathy. And then there is value in the emotional empathy, what we traditionally think of as empathy. And quite honestly, a lot of designers borderline on sympathy, meaning that the best that they've been able to achieve is, oh yeah, I've been through that. And so now I understand that, right? And that's not bad in and of itself, but it's not the same thing as empathy, which is not to put yourself in someone's shoes, but just to understand their emotional being at this particular moment. And good design research can do that if it's applied well. The next thing is creating clarity and behavioral fit. And to me, these are the 2 sides of what I would call, what Dick Buchanan calls the 4 orders of design, which one is the artifact, right? To me, that's the clarity piece. That's the thing that like graphic design does really, really well. And it's something that all designers that go through a sense of foundation in one way or another should be able to achieve no matter what kind of design they're doing, which is why industrial designers are really good at this, architects are really good at this, those types of design. The behavioral fit piece is the relatively new piece, and that's where interaction design comes in, right? And interaction design is first and foremost based on how can I use design as a way of understanding people's behavior, but then how can I design things so I fit that behavior and create new behavior that are good for the whole, right? And so that's the next piece. The last piece is exploration. And I think this is what's different from engineering in a lot of ways. Exploration to me is not knowing an answer, but just trying lots of things. It's spitballing. It's throwing spaghetti against the wall. It's just trying stuff. And one thing that I've found is that in the Silicon Valley influenced world, we've been losing our exploratory edge as designers and being pushed more towards experimentation, which is, here's what I think is the answer to the hypothesis, let's test it, right? Alan Cooper recently put out something that he came out against the prototype and test culture that's coming out of Silicon Valley, where you're constantly starting from your own opinion and just validating it. And that's not the way design is meant to work. Design is meant to use creation as a form of understanding the other before you start suggesting answers. And we're sort of losing that, and that's something that we can create and revalue. And the last thing is envisioning, that design is really good about coming up with the future possibilities. What are those possibilities? How can we drive those? What are those creative fictions that can come across? And because of those clarity skills that I mentioned before, we can really put those visual tools together in order to create those visions and those positive futures. Some of the tools that we use to get there are pretty standard tools. They're not really like all that interesting in and of themselves, but they're important, which is storytelling, visual thinking, information presentation, workshops, and prototyping and simulation. I'm not going to go into deep of those because they're kind of self-explanatory. But the disciplines that use these things are research, design research, facilitation, interaction design, information architecture, and user interface design. This is not meant to be comprehensive, it's just meant to be a list. There are many other disciplines, but these are the ones that match most closely to the tools I talked about. This value of design is not just a value for its customers, it's actually a value to the organization, which is probably why I'm here, right? It's all about organizational design, and that's what we're going to talk about. And so that's sort of the setup. Now, so I talk about this thing called design operations. Sometimes it's truncated to mean design ops. or DevOps, which is even worse, though I must admit I helped contribute to it. But we all make mistakes. But one of the confusions that people have is around something that is also really an important influence, which is this idea of DevOps. How many people know what DevOps is? In what?
In real DevOps or what people perceive DevOps is?
Either. I'll accept either. You obviously have a deeper understanding than I do. But I work in the cloud community, and the cloud is definitely, and cloud technologies is definitely an area where DevOps shines. But one thing that I had to learn is that DevOps is not developer ops. It's actually a very different thing. So when I say design ops, I'm actually thinking more of what could have been developer ops more than DevOps. So there's some lessons there for myself along the way. But, excuse me. So DevOps, though, is IT infrastructure built around the concepts of continuous integration, continuous development, and hopefully continuous learning, which we learned some about this morning, and continuous delivery. But what's also really important is that you couldn't have what's known as digital transformation today without DevOps. You couldn't have an Amazon or a Google or a Netflix without DevOps. They are transitioning everything and transforming everything because of what DevOps can do. And some of the lessons learned from DevOps, besides the continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is really important, is this notion of automation and self-healing. So because everything can be software defined in the cloud infrastructure world and in programming and everything, it means that software can fix it. If software can define it, software can fix it. Now, of course, we have the whole singularity problem here, but we'll worry about that later. Let Elon Musk worry about that. But one of the things that they're always doing is measuring as you go. And I think like the lean movement, the lean startup movement has definitely picked up on this and has really pushed it forward in a lot of organizations. But another big part of the DevOps culture is share, share, share. Inside the organization usually, but it can also be between organizations. Inside the organization, it's about creating structures that allow everyone to be transparent with everything that's going on so that anyone at any time is empowered, and thus the autonomy and accountability mentioned below that come along with that. And the last thing is this notion, it's a really off metaphor if you're a little squeamish in your stomach, but this notion of cattle versus pets. So imagine a whole room about this big filled with pizza boxes of computers. Now, if you were about, 5-10 years ago, you would be really concerned about every little pizza box in this room, thinking that it was completely and utterly irreplaceable. They're all little pets. You'd give them names like Frodo and Samwise and things like that because you cared about them, right? They were kind of a thing. Now, let's increase this data center that I was just describing to the size of the city block, right? And not only is the data center that way, but the data center also is made up of virtualized units. They're not even real, right? So you're going to create all these virtual things. They become so enormous in terms of scale that you can't name them all, even if you tried, right? So who knows Gru and the Minions? He's tried really well to name all of them, right? And as far as we know, he has, though we haven't really heard every single one of them. But it's sort of that problem at that scale. But one of the other advantages of this whole software-defined universe is that if I have 100 virtual servers per pizza box, I don't care if one of those dies because I have another 99 in that single unit of a pizza box. So what I can do is I can run tests, and I can try to hit the peak scale of what that capacity could be on purpose to see when it would break so that I can learn something and kill it. I basically kill it on purpose. It's cattle. I don't care. You guys get the whole pets versus cattle thing? But this goes on at larger and larger scale. So a few years ago, Amazon had an entire data center in North Carolina go out. An entire data center. Only one company was unaffected by it in terms of performance. Anyone guess what that company was? Nope, Amazon was affected. They were affected in big ways, actually, mainly because they got so many calls they couldn't handle it anymore, but yeah. It was Netflix, which is their largest customer by far. Netflix has other problems in that they can't get off of Amazon, but that's a whole other thing. But because they actually took this pets versus cattle metaphor to the data center level and said, I can actually test my system and kill a data center and still run, that's how much they've been able to scale and be ready for this testing and learning as well as performance environment. That's to give you a little heads up on how digital is having an impact here. But let's go back to design operations. I have two major goals with design operations based on the previous statement about value that I made earlier on. The first one is, it's really about setting up my team for success. I want my team to be successful. That's my number one driver as a design manager, is their success. I'm not successful unless they are, is what I've told every one of my employees when they join. The last thing is increase the value of my organization's investment in me, in my design team, in the design process and infrastructure that they build. Those are really simply the only two goals. I don't try to get all convoluted with like, my goal is to hit this KPI or that KPI. No. I'm really simple about this. So what is design ops? So I break it down to three things, and I'm kind of like manufacturing kind of person about this. The first thing are the rails. These are things that keep you focused and keep you having direction. I'm very much a vision, direction kind of person, so this is a big deal for me. The next thing is the grease. It's the things that keep things flowing, right? And this is where operations really expands into areas that most people in the design community haven't really been thinking about yet, which is, how does my human resources work? How are my collaboration systems set up? What are my systems of spaces and how I do that as well, especially in today's world of distributed teams? And the last part is the tooling, right? How do I keep things working? How do I keep things happening? And this has to do with interoperability and workflow and governance and things like that. So let's talk about Rails. So the first thing I want to talk about is principles. How many people who work in a design organization or who have worked for design organizations had principles, design principles in those organizations? Okay. Cool. I have seen a lot of design principles in my time. I've studied design principles. There's actually a website that makes it real easy called designprinciplesftw.com, which kind of makes it really easy, but they have like everyone's design principles and heuristics, and they mix and match. Like if you've ever used the word principle in describing what your list is, it's a principle. And a couple of things that I learned is principles, in order to be effective, are not common sense. So words like easy, intuitive, simple should not be in your design principles. Would you ever make something difficult? Would you ever make something not intuitive for your customer? If you're truly customer-centric, right? You wouldn't. So those things don't really matter. The other thing is, it's not your process. Some people include in their principles, get out of the building. Of course you should get out of the building. Why make that a principle? That might be a value statement that you need to evangelize through your organization, right? But it's not a principle. And let me get back to what they are, because they also aren't latest trends, but that's obvious. They're how you differentiate yourself. They bring up your brand voice for your organization, and they reflect your customers' special needs. So it's about your organization first and foremost, and about how you achieve customer success for your organization. Here's an example, and I won't read this whole thing, but this is what we did when I was at Rackspace. And we did a lot of work on coming up with these. We workshopped throughout the entire organization. Fortunately, it was relatively small at 6,000 people, but we were able to work through the entire product organization of 1,500 in order to get to these and really wordsmith them. But one thing we did in terms of the structure is purposely make it first person as the principal title. So meet me where I am as I am. I call that the Popeye principle. I am what I am, and it's all that I am. And then it's a description from our point of view. Our customers engage us in many ways, so we support them regardless of device type, platform, location, spoken language, operational model, business maturity, etc. The other thing is that they're always aspirational. If it's easy to do, then why bother listing it, right? It needs to be aspirational in a way. It needs to be something you don't do now, but you want to move closer and closer towards. I'm not going to read all of these, but you guys can get a quick glance at them. But we also turned them into a heuristic. In this case, we made a more broad heuristic, so they inform the heuristic, the expert evaluation. But we came up with a form based on Forrester's form, Forrester Research's heuristic form, and we made some modifications to it. But they based it on a 4-point scale. The first two are negative, the second two are positive. You can't have anything in the middle on purpose. Don't worry about the 5s, those are mistakes on purpose. But the idea is then translating all of these into a spider graph, so then you can see change over time. So as I do a change to the system, I would do another evaluation, or I would run a usability test using the same basic questions of the evaluation, and I would see how the spider graph changes over time. We also have points of annotation and stuff like that in the system as well. But converting principles into being actionable is a really important part of operations. Otherwise, your principles are just really pretty poster boards that really don't do anything for you. So from an operational perspective, especially if you want non-designers to feel value in them, you have to make them operational. Org structure. Someone asked me about this before. So important things to be planning for when you're thinking about your org structure is scaling over time, how do I transform versus building, and cultural issues and values. I'll put this here. Now where should I put my design organization this year? Okay, this week. How many people have been through like, hey, where are we going to put the design organization today? When I was at HPE, it changed. It felt like daily. At Rackspace, it changed like monthly. Now I'm sort of a little more stable. It's lasted 4 months. We'll see if it lasts any longer. But I'm okay there. But one caveat to all of this, or one like kind of demand I would make, if you are not working to get your top design leader to be peer with engineering and product, you're doing it wrong. That if they are not peers, then it means you are diminished and you are not being valued as a design organization. And I've been in too many places where there wasn't an executive design role when they had a team of 50 or 60 people under them. And you can't evangelize your team, you can't give them enough air cover, you can't actually influence strategy from a position if you're not peers with those who are also influencing that strategy. To do that kind of design work of your organization, it requires all functions to be involved. You're impacting them as much as anything. It needs to be based on the value, the understanding of the value of design that you've come up together with, hopefully. And it needs to be guided by a roadmap towards some kind of strategic vision. And the last thing is it needs to be about balancing skills. So one thing that I talk about is an area of this golden ratio. I don't know if this number's right anymore. There's someone from IBM in the room, but this was the last one I heard. Close enough? Close enough without breaking IP, I get it, okay. But IBM's working towards this pretty low ratio, which is, I thought was extreme because this was the first number I heard, and anything below 1 to 10 felt like idealistic to me because I was dealing at HPE with 1 to 1,000 engineers to designers, so it felt kind of cool to see 1 to 8. But then Gartner came up with this, and I read this, and I was like, you're flipping me out. 1 to 3? Like, who's a designer? Like, that just brought up so many questions, and they didn't go into details. But then, last year at the Enterprise UX Conference, one of the former heads of design at Intuit did a presentation, and they said they do 1 designer per product manager minimally. Sometimes it's like, on average, I think she was saying if it's greater than 1 is what they're going for. And there were 2 things here. It was the first time I ever heard anyone talk about a ratio to product manager, because it's always been to engineering in the past. And then the other thing was that it was more than 1 to 1, that it was like 1.25, 1.5, right? Like it's an average based on need. And I found that really interesting as well. Something we're going to explore a little bit later is this idea of Dualtrack and discovery versus delivery, and that kind of changes things. I'll try to lean out of the way, but we're going to talk more about what those are. But again, it's mostly a 1-to-1 between product management and design. But then you have dev and research and visual design and stuff like that in there as well, which are borrowed resources. Another conversation that I had in building the Enterprise UX conference this last year was around different types of leadership. And this was something new for me. I hadn't really thought about it. I've heard of managers and leaders, and you can be a leader as an individual contributor. But I didn't really think about the differences between all of the different leader types. And this person, his name is Uday Ganjadar, on our team, brought up these 3 types of leadership. There's trade craft, which is about leading the tangible craft themselves. There's stagecraft, which sets the scene in creating immediate environmental success. And quite honestly, that's where I am in my career, is in the stagecraft arena. And then finally would be more like the executive who's working at statecraft and diplomacy and the vision and working at that level. And then when you're designing your organization, not just your design organization, are you prepping the growth of your design team to be able to have these 3 levels of design? Are you creating a growth path that includes principal designers who could really be in charge of the trade craft while your management starts dealing with the statecraft? And are you getting to the point where you're ready for a true executive in your design team? Not all organizations are. But are you getting there? At DigitalOcean, we've taken the point of view of the opposite approach. Instead of growing it up, we're growing it down. So our first 2 major hires was the VP, my boss, and he's thinking of statecraft, and then the second hire was me. And then we're building a team under us. And it's really set things up differently. It's the first time I've been in an organization like that. I'll let you know how it goes. So far, so good. I'm 4 months in. We'll see how it is. I have a team of 8 now. So that's the fastest hiring I've ever been able to do as well, which we'll talk about how that works. So we talked about the rails. Let's talk about some grease. It's the word, they say. So probably the biggest thing I think about, mainly because of my position and this top-down kind of management building structure we came up with, is human resources. I am all about recruiting. I've been all about recruiting for 4 months. I'm still all about recruiting more than I should be. So I think about these things like every day. And fortunately, my team is really digging this concept too. And fortunately, I'm in an organization that thinks about this stuff incredibly intentionally as well. You can find a blog on the DigitalOcean site. We just released our new hiring policies to create a more human hiring process. I'm pretty proud of what they came up with about it. But these issues of recruitment, and I would add sourcing before recruitment, onboarding, career path, compensation, benefits, rewards and recognition, development and education, they all need to be intentional for your teams in order to create a successful design team. Obviously, these things are for every team, not just design, but are you doing it for your design team as intentionally as you are generically? And this is one thing that I've noticed, especially in software organizations, is design teams generally inherit what the other guys have done. So they either inherit marketing, if they're lucky, but they usually inherit engineering, which is so different culturally from design. So how do we make that work from a human resource perspective? So developing your team, it's important to make sure you're thinking intentionally about the balance of skills. If everyone all of a sudden wants to be the best visual designer on your team or a visual communicator, it's not really helping you. So you need to kind of think about that. You need your team to think strategically with you. And if they do have interests in areas that you can't support, that's okay. Your job is to make them successful. Maybe making them successful outside your organization is okay. That doesn't work against you, that works for you, because you know what they're going to do is they're going to send you the right candidate later. It will boomerang back to you in your favor. And all of this is about that. So one thing is about scaling. You need to start with generalists. You need to start with people who have a really broad horizontal line on their T, and hopefully they have something to offer a little bit more depth vertically in that as well. Jared Spool uses this idea of the broken comb for true generalists, which is that you have this really broad thing on the top of your comb going horizontally, and then you have like broken spine, basically, tines, right? Tines of the comb that have different lengths, but they're all of them, and that's a true generalist. I like T-types, and I like building my team into a comb, but if you're starting in the beginning and you only have 2 hires, you need some comb of people, right, to do everything that's needed. I was lucky to be able to hire so many so fast. Invest in your people. They deserve it, and you need it. So one of the things that I've heard from managers or human resource executives before is, if we send them for education, they'll just leave after they get it. How many times have you heard that? Anyone's ever heard that one before? Yeah. Okay, who has ever heard of an employee leaving because they got educated? You gave them something for nothing. They're going to leave you? No, they're going to wait for the next carrot you give them, right? They're going to expect more.
And the counter is, what if you don't educate them and they stay?
Yeah, then they're useless, right? They're not valuable to you. Totally, great point. Thank you. Sorry. I love when people make a better point than I do on my own talks. So, the next thing here is you need to communicate what it means to be a person in a role. This is an example we did at Rackspace. I've done the same thing at HPE and doing it now at DigitalOcean. But people need to understand what's expected of them and what's expected if they need to go to the next thing. I think IBM actually, Adam Cutler does a great presentation in IBM of their career path tracking, and they've done a really good job like this as well. I know other organizations that have a lot of good design ops are doing this stuff too. Well, we came up with this basically for my education experience and just to have an assessment matrix like I did for my students, and it kind of works. We kind of added this thing which kind of shows you a continuum of different qualities and where you can kind of be, and they kind of work within these areas. It's very qualitative. The one thing that we found really invaluable in terms of communicating with our staff is this element and this element. So here's how much experience we expect you to have. It's not meant to be a litmus test. It's meant to be a guide. We know that there are people who are really fast learners and really good at gaining experience and adapting. So it's not about, oh, if you have 4 years, you can't do this. But it's about guides. But the more important thing we found was this one. If you're in a role, how long should you be there so that you have enough experience to move forward? And it's really gotten our people to think about, oh wait, it's not just about a skills checklist. I also need to develop wisdom. And wisdom takes time, and it's really hard to rush that. And this is where we've kind of put that in place, because you can't quantify wisdom, right? So we really want people to have some kind of sitting power inside their roles for a while before they move on. The other reason is that every time you move on to a role, you're teaching the previous role. And in order to teach something, you need to have mastery of it. And mastery takes time. Collaboration. You need to have the right tools to increase engagement. This is the difference between SharePoint and Slack. Slack increases engagement. Now, we'll talk about the problem with Slack in a minute. I will confess, another one of my lenses is I'm not a millennial, so Slack is a little interesting to me. I love Slack, but it also creates some problems. But SharePoint, oh my God, it's where engagement goes to die, right? And so sorry if there's any Microsoft or teamwork people in the room. I said the same thing 10 years ago about Lotus Notes. Got to hit the IBM person again. But yeah, so it has to increase engagement, and you can measure engagement. We all, there's plenty of tools that HR has for understanding engagement. So you can learn and measure as you go. You need to have spaces to externalize work, and I'm being very general here about the term space, virtual space and physical space, but you need to externalize, right? So whether you're using Mural or Infusion as digital places to do that externalization, or you have a real studio and there's plenty of wall space, but you can externalize work, externalizing work and thinking processes is really important for collaboration. And then the last thing is right mindset. You need to be able to contribute, critique, and instruct in order to collaborate along the way. And so some of the cultural elements I put here is openness, transparency or visibility, instruction, and criticism. But it should feel natural. And anytime it's not feeling natural, it means there's room for improvement. And I think we all have room for improvement in our collaboration models because some of it feels a little bit awkward. And also there's different cultural models and different mindsets. How do you create a collaboration system that's as good for introverts as it is for extroverts, and vice versa? Different systems work to different benefits. But one thing I learned in dealing with multicultural environments is that there is a difference between collaboration and coordination. So I learned this lesson the hard way by organizing conferences in Europe, and I didn't understand that collaboration was coordination in Holland. Anyone from Holland here? Oh, good. Oh, he raises his hand very slowly. 2 more people. All right. They're together. They can hug each other after. But in my experience, and I'll make it my experience, I'm a collaborator. I'm also an extreme extrovert, right? So I'm very good in front of people and with people, and I learn with people, not alone. Like, I'm an extrovert. I get energy from people. So I'm even more about collaboration than your average American would be. And so for me, I was like, hey, let's work on this together. I don't care about time zones. I'll wake up at 3 a.m. I'm in it. And they were like, no, we're going to go off and do our thing, and we'll come back and report back to you when we're done. And it seemed to be across the board, the entire team, even though they were from different companies and different part of Holland, like, it was just seemed to be part of what it was. And I talked to people about it, and like, yep, that's how they work. And I was like, oh. Because when people go off and come back, it means that they're not engaged with each other. And that's not collaboration. Because what it means is you're saying, here, I have the answer. You're going to agree with me, right? When you do coordination. When you do collaboration, you're already pre-aligned because you've done it together. And it sidesteps so much conflict and so much tension by collaborating instead. And that's the goal of doing it together. So, moving on to tools. So, we need to have tools to do stuff, especially as digital designers, lots of tools. These are some things that I think about when I think about choosing the tools for my team. There was this discussion recently on a Slack, and I realized I didn't tell you the bad part about Slack, is the noise ratio, right? It's really engaged, but a lot of noise, especially with all those animated GIFs from Giphy that have nothing to do with work, right? There's that, right? My Slack at work, we have a remote company, like 50% of the company is remote. Slack has 550 channels. There's a channel for cat lovers. There's a channel for diving. There's a channel for foodies and wine. Nothing to do with work. Everyone's engaged on Slack, which means when you do have work questions, you know that people are there. So there's a reason for all of that noise, is it keeps people engaged in the tool, even though it's slightly less productive, so that they can be productive when they have to, right? So it has a positive and negative side. Going back to this. When I think about interoperability of formats, it's something I maybe it's a little bit older, back from my fireworks days. Anyone else love fireworks as much as I do? Fireworks? No fans of fireworks. Huh? Everyone's already adopted Sketch and they're like over it, right? Or no one's old enough. So, sorry, I was there with like Fireworks 1.0. So, interoperability of formats. So back in Fireworks Day, I can open up a PSD file and I can make a PSD file, a Photoshop file. It was interoperable. So I didn't have to mess with anybody else's issue because they all still loved Photoshop. It was interoperable. I didn't mess with the system, the operational working. And there's other things about that. You need to keep people connected as part of your tools. Enabling remote experiences is growingly important. How many people have distributed teams? That's it? What do you mean? How can you not raise your hand? It's distributed. If you ever have to get on a video call, you're on a distributed team. Okay? Sorry. Which is different than remote. Remote is usually what I think of as when you have like 1 or 2 workers who work from home, who don't work in an office, versus distributed where you can have many offices around the world. They have a lot of the similar problems with each other. But you need to enable remote experiences for no other reason except Tobias here. He's not in Germany right now. He's in Barcelona, and I assure you he's gotten emails and text messages from work that he's had to answer since he's been in Barcelona. You don't turn it off, right? That's being a remote worker too, is that you travel. Hopefully you're doing research, which means you travel. You're a remote worker, either part-time if you're doing your job correctly and getting out of the building like we talked before. So you need to enable those things. And then you need to connect designers to stakeholders and collaborators. So make sure you have the right tools in place so that you're connecting them to the right things. But there's this one major hurdle, which is probably more to most of y'all's experience than to mine, though my experience in dealing with this hurdle has been kind of painful, is IT and procurement. I had a boss who called procurement the 7th layer of Dante's Inferno. It is one of these organizations, like many parts of IT, that is designed for the word no, and not in the nicest of ways. So part of the transformation that you need to do to operationalize your design team, as well as all of your teams, is to help convert them to an empowered yes. They should be an organization that is designed, just like HR is, to empower the value and amplify the value of your organization, while still maintaining the compliance laws and compliance needs and privacy and security that they're responsible for. But how can they do that from the perspective of, that's a really great idea, it's a challenge, how can we make this challenge work, as opposed to, no way, man, the FCC is going to come down me on that, or our IP protection lawyers will just say no. I worked in too many organizations that wouldn't even allow Slack because it wasn't an internally served product, right? And there's tons of cloud hosting tools out there. What got me was I was at HPE. Hope there's no one from HPE here, I doubt it. But I was at HPE for 2 years, and we were a cloud infrastructure organization. We were supplying the pizza boxes for some of the biggest cloud SaaS organizations in the world, but we had a policy of not using SaaS. We basically couldn't use our customers' tools. We were empowering them, but not to empower us. Talk about hypocrisy, as well as, the safer word would have been paradox, but no, it's a hypocrisy. So what are some of the tools? So for collaboration, you need to make sure there's real-time methods of communicating. You need to make sure that there's async. You have time zones to deal with, or you just have flow to deal with. So sometimes people just can't answer you right now. So you need to have an async method, and I think that's one of the reasons Slack works so well. It's because it does both really well. You need to have whiteboards and Post-its, and they need to be both digital and physical, obviously. And you need to have means of doing feedback and review in as passive a way as possible. The next thing is asset management. There have been some really bad tools created for digital asset management. We have really good GitHub and stuff like that, but nothing that really does Photoshop or Sketch really well. There's a growing market there, but it's not mature yet. Testing and data collection needs to be done in that continuous way. How do you create a workflow and tool it so that it can happen? Knowledge management. We're dealing with this right now in my little small immature organization where, yeah, let's just create a wiki. And I'm like, oh man, wiki's another place where things go to die. So how do you do knowledge management well? I don't know yet, but they're going to try a wiki. Empower my team to do what they think is best. Then version control. You need to maintain those. Comes with asset management. You need to have some kind of network storage. That's not a remote drive in some place. Like, you need something like Dropbox. You need something like Drive so that it's done in as easy a way, synced way as possible. And last thing is project and resource management. There may be other tools, but this is sort of my attempt at a comprehensive list. The next thing here is workflow. You have intake, you have collaboration and delivery. The connections and process that move things to go through. You guys are all about process management. You all know about workflow to do this stuff. But when I think about workflow and good workflow, I've been really concentrating on these things. It requests answers. It needs to create quality design value. And it answers the questions of others. What questions do you need answered so that you can take what I've done, right? Even though it's a collaborative system, you still own expertise, and you need to make sure that you're answering and delivering answers. You're getting questions and delivering answers, basically. And the last thing is that your workflow tool needs to be agnostic. I'm just going to glare. Needs to be tool agnostic as feasibly possible. A lot of process management tools that I've seen all of a sudden start bringing in other tools unnecessarily. So when you start creating suites, it starts creating forced flow that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And this is where you end up with an engineering-centric workflow model, right? So like Jira and Confluence and HipChat all work great together, but designers hate all of them, even though they're made by a design-centric organization, which is ironic. But yeah, I guess because they're not designing them for designers. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now I've gone through all of those pieces. I want to talk about the environment in which we work. So this is a graphic that a couple of friends of mine put together. It's actually a hobby. To talk about the landscape of designing and execution. And what we were trying to do is there's a maintenance phase that's ongoing, there's a build phase, there's a plan phase, there's a direction phase, and then it keeps going out into the distance. And you need to have kind of like all of these players in place as your organization matures. And what we were trying to think about when we were creating this is this notion of discovery, and how to operationalize discovery within organizations that are focused on delivery. And how do we do that in a way where we don't disregard their value of delivery, but get them to think about the value of discovery at the same time. And like I added understanding to empathy before, I've added understanding to what's known as a Dualtrack model. So this is a classic Dualtrack in this bottom part right here. So you have a discovery track and a delivery track. The work of Jeff Patton and Marty Kagan talk about this. And so in your discovery track, you're basically testing hypotheses and outputting requirements and validating those requirements as you go. It's waterfall. Just going to out that for a minute. It's just being done very quickly. But it's also not blocking delivery from happening. So who works in an organization where they have 0 things in their backlog? Ty, do you have nothing in your backlog? Okay. There's probably enough in a backlog of your average engineering team to last years. So if you take a chunk of resource and you say, we're going to work on discovery, you're not blocking your delivery team. And this is the one thing I want to say strongly, because it's usually the one thing that people are most scared about. Are you going to, by entering this waterfall world, keep my delivery from flowing? And the answer is definitely not. And there's 2 main sources of backlog. The highest one is debt. There's no application I've ever seen in the world that does not have technology and experience debt. And the other one is escalation, right? You work for a company that has big companies as customers, you listen to the big customers at will, right? So we have SAP over here. If Boeing came up to you and said, we have a licensing issue because you won't have this feature by the end of the year, you're going to get that feature in because that's a $500 million contract, right? Same thing with IBM and those types of enterprises. In my world, it only has to be a couple of $1,000s before it hits an escalation, but yeah. But I've lived the multi-million-dollar version of that too. It all becomes fractals. It's just all fractals. So you have this idea of discovery, and so what I think of discovery as is getting to the right design. Both Phil Buxton and Alan Cooper talk about this concept of getting to the right design. When you talk about delivery from a design perspective, this is where you use agile methodologies to get built right from a design perspective, as well as from an engineering perspective. But this is where you focus on things like usability. This is where you focus on things like interaction design of the system and system design issues within it and service design issues. But there was one thing missing from this that was really hounding me, which was this next thing I added, which was this understanding layer, which from this image was sort of like this guy here and this guy here. How do I get to the horizon? How do I go even further? How do I get strategic in what it is I'm doing? And so I've added this right thing. So this is right design. This is the right thing kind of thing. And what you'll see here is there's these 3 layers which represent these 2 plus this 1. And this one kind of goes through it, and it takes data from all 3 layers. And you'll see the 3 layers better articulated here. So here's sort of the delivery layer, which we call production. Then you have the discovery layer, which is direction or navigation, right? And then you have the discovery understanding layer. And you see they each have a touch point with the one below it. And they're all driving outward from where they are because they're going into the future. But they're also always in cycles. So there's basically a difference. They're all in cycles, but they all have a different cadence. But they're all impacting each other. That was my 5 minutes. Oh, man. So from this, though, I want to talk about governance really quickly because, again, you all are business process people for the most part. So decision-making. I think you were talking about that as a main thing, that people need to know where decisions are made and who can be responsible for them. But that's like needs to be articulated and needs to be operationalized, right? How do you know when a decision needs to be made, let alone who should make it? How do you make the decision? Where is the decision articulated in a way that it can be remembered, right? All of those things need to be there. Autonomy is a cultural reference I'll call out, but how can you make a governance model that allows for autonomy to occur? Because autonomy is the thing that's going to create pace more than anything else. But at the same time, you need to manage risk, So how do you do autonomy while managing risk? You need to operationalize those measures so you can keep the system going. And you need to maintain privacy and security through the system as was required by your industries. Just really quickly, I'll make these slides available to everybody so we can go through this. But research operations, I keep as tangential to design operations. It has its own thing. These are some of the things that you need to operationalize just to do design research, user research. It's a lot. Whenever my organization tries to do research, recruitment is probably the #1 thing that keeps them from moving forward. I have 5 research projects going on right now, and they're all like, we can't get anyone to do what we need them to do. And it's like, I know, it's really hard. Keep at it and like we'll figure out how to operationalize it as we grow. But it takes a lot of effort. But the other parts of it are also important. One thing that we came up with is this idea of having a research hub where you get to express the data, but you also get to express the insights from the data so that the whole organization is both contributing to the data, because data just doesn't come from user research, it comes from market research, it comes from market analysts. Any place that you can bring data in that can help you better understand and empathize with your customers. The next part is leading. So what does it take to lead? So do you need a design operations leader? Many organizations are starting to say the answer is yes. They always call it something different. The most common one in the United States recently is chief of staff, which is something they've taken from other parts of the organization and have applied to design. But sometimes there's a director of design ops if you have enough scale for it. But the role needs to start immediately. It most likely is your highest level manager, and then becomes part-time as a line manager. I already have someone who I'm thinking about in my team. And then finally, it's a full-time position as you scale and grow, right? At what point that scale is will be dependent on your operational problems. These are some of the things the role includes. I'll let you guys read. You guys can read faster than I can talk. I know I'm from New York and I talk really fast, but I bet you can read faster. And then the last thing is, what are the qualities that a design operations lead needs to have? They need to be thinking about the system, which a lot of designers aren't really good at. They're very good at the particulate more than the system. And they need to have... Hallelujah! Give me an amen. And then they need to have experience in different design contexts. So the best design ops people are previous graphic designers who went to interaction design, who also have industrial design experience in managing those different teams, or of service design or whatever, but have a multiplicity of design experience to make it happen. And they're really good at influencing. These are the people, you know, who just in there getting coffee and drinks with everybody and doing lunch and know how to influence people to get stuff done. My VP, who kind of like owned operations at Rackspace, he was the best influencer I ever saw. He had procurement in his pocket practically. I don't know how he did it. I wasn't there for the moment, but like he was able to say, "You're just going to do what I say," and they did. And I was like, "Huh? How did that happen? Tell me more." These are some of the qualifications, a little deeper. And so then we're going to put a bow on it, take the cultural learning of DevOps and infuse it with the empathy, infusion, and vision that design brings. You make it happen by starting small and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Everyone talks about don't boil oceans. All right, so boil a bay, right? Pick a different water body. Start with a pond if you have to. Be sure to include, drill hard into aligning value. It's something that most teams aren't going to be used to hearing, but it's really important to get that alignment of value and meaning. Measure continuously and adjust accordingly. I know that's been said a bunch of times. And then imagine success and work to make it happen. So imagine what it looks like, what are your desired outcomes, what will success be, and then create the path to make that happen. Design it. Little plug at the end here. This is my upcoming conference that I help organize, Design Ops Summit. Come to my home in New York. It's in Queens at the Museum of the Moving Image, which is Edison's former studio, film studio. So it's a cool place, and it's not in Manhattan, so it's cheaper. And I'd love to see some of you, if not all of you, there. And these are ways to connect and learn more about me.